Today's event is taking place on the stolen land of Tohono O'odham, O'odham Druid, and Pasquayaqui Peoples Territory, colonized and now known as Tucson, Arizona. Connecting with this land and holding a moment of remembrance is one way WFSA practices decolonizing and unsettling the systems of colonialism that live around and within us. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Women's Foundation for the State of Arizona's Virtual Luncheon, Day 1. To kick off today's program, we join WFSA CEO, Dr. Amalia Luxardo, in studio.
Good afternoon, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our 2022 Virtual Luncheon. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, staff, and supporters, thank you for attending. This past year has been one of growth for our organization. For those of you that are new, we were formerly the Women's Foundation of Southern Arizona, and late last year, we became the Women's Foundation for the State of Arizona. I want to thank our longtime supporters and welcome those of you joining us for the first time. As a gift, we are raffling our mixology kit and swag box at the end of the day, so remember to stick around. Over the next 3 days, we will cover some of the work WFSA does in support of our mission, where we innovate to create social, political, and economic change that achieves equity for women and girls. We do this through our integrated framework of research, advocacy, grant-making, and leadership development. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors. Thank you, TEP, for returning this year as our presenting sponsor. We appreciate your unwavering commitment to the work of WFSA. And to Cox, Tucson Local Media, and Southwest Airlines, thank you for supporting us as gold sponsors for this year's event.
We all want clean energy to protect our environment. We also need reliable energy to power our modern, busy lives. TEP's plan for a cleaner, greener grid means we don't have to choose. We're making our energy as clean as we can, as fast as we can, without compromising safety, reliability, or affordability. By 2035, we'll be providing 70% of our power from renewable resources. We're already on the right track with new wind and solar projects that will more than double our community-scale clean energy capacity. We plan to reduce carbon emissions 80% by replacing our remaining coal-fired power plants with wind, solar, and storage systems.
For more than 25 years, Cox has been an important economic engine and community leader. We plan to continue providing access to advanced technologies essential to a prosperous economy and vibrant community.
At Southwest Airlines, it's always been about heart. It's about loving people, about putting others first. It's about building resilience through connections that last. Because distance shouldn't keep us from being neighbors. It's about living responsibly and doing things the Southwest way. We believe the act of connecting starts with heart.
Today, we will hear from advocate and author Stephanie Land, sharing her personal journey out of poverty. We will also meet a dynamic duo from the University of Washington, demonstrating the research behind the groundbreaking Self-Sufficiency Standard report, making a case for livable wages. Today's keynote speaker, Stephanie Land, is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Maid: Hard Work, Low Pay, and a Mother's Will to Survive. An honest portrait of her years as a maid, earning a paltry living while raising her daughter and trying to claw her way out of poverty. Stephanie shares a heartbreaking tale of everyday American who are overworked, underpaid, and often invisible to the very people they serve. Most recently, her book has inspired a limited-run series on Netflix titled Maid. Please welcome Stephanie Land.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and an absolute privilege to have the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you all for listening. It gives me a lot of hope to know that people are out there, that my story is reaching so many ears. In January of 2019, my memoir, Maid, was published and received critical acclaim. This honestly surprised me. I didn't expect people to pay attention to a single mother living in poverty, working as a house cleaner, and struggling to make ends meet. Because for me, it was an isolating, invisible existence. At times, I had no idea how I would make it out. It is my very personal story of survival. It is also a story of privilege. I have often wondered and am sometimes reassured that people are grasping onto my story because I look like them. I could be their sister or neighbor because I am plain-faced and white, because I am described as educated and inspirational and resilient. We don't like to hear from people who aren't those things. We especially don't like to hear from people who live in systemic poverty, who experience personal attacks on their gender, or live in systemic racism. Their stories of struggle. For many, struggle is almost completely wrapped in shame. We distance ourselves from stories of hardship, especially from people who don't look like us. As a defense mechanism, we distance ourselves from people who live in poverty. Poverty is a scary, vulnerable place to imagine. Think of losing your home, your belongings, and moving your family into a car. And then think of that car breaking down. Due to our government's failure to protect its most vulnerable citizens, millions of Americans are facing this scenario at this very moment. People try to protect themselves by placing blame on poor people. I have heard these narratives constantly, being a tattooed single mother who writes about being on food stamps and then chooses to publish those things on the internet. People tell me I should have gone to college sooner. I should have had an abortion. I should have gotten married before having kids. What the people who do this are really saying is, I didn't make the bad choices that you made, and so I made good choices, and I will never end up like you. But what really happens in this thinking is it becomes that because I brought it on myself, they shouldn't have to help me or feel like they need to. Since my book was published, and especially since the Netflix series from my book came out, I've heard from countless others around the country who have lived or are living a similar existence of poverty, discrimination, domestic violence, and homelessness. My story is not unique. It is an all too common narrative with so many untold stories waiting to be heard. I chose to begin my written story with this sentence. My daughter learned to walk in a homeless shelter. My hope in writing those words was to shed some light on the reality of poverty in America. But this is the existence for the 1 in 4 children who currently go hungry in this country, whose families line up at a food bank and sometimes wait for hours. The shock and how quickly this happened at the start of the pandemic is what I've been nearly screaming about for half a decade. Whenever they came out with a new report that said Americans were 2 lost paychecks or 1 major medical emergency away from being houseless, I never thought that I would witness it happen to millions in real time. In my own experience with falling into poverty, some people have told me I have a really hard time seeing it that way. My daughter's story didn't learn to walk in a homeless shelter because I'd chosen to bring her into the world. She took those first steps on that dirty, tiled floor because I just escaped an abusive relationship with a couple $100, because my family had turned their backs on me, or they couldn't help us, because I simply couldn't find work. And because I couldn't find work, a grant for childcare wasn't obtainable. You see, I needed to obtain a job that I could do while my daughter was at daycare before I'd even get approved for that grant. And because most of the daycare centers who accepted that grant were open Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, the evening or weekend work and the restaurant work that I'd done through my 20s was not an option. Without office skills or a college degree, and in the height of a recession-era job market, cleaning houses rose to the surface as the only job that I could do. During those years, I worked through illness and brought my daughter to daycare when she was sick and should have been at home with me. My job offered no sick pay, no vacation days, no foreseeable increase in wage, and yet I begged to work more. Wages lost from missed work hours could rarely be made up. And if I missed too many, I risked being fired. My car's reliability was vital, since a broken hose or even a flat tire would throw us off and knock us backward and send us falling back to homelessness again. I relied on government assistance to survive. Child care grants, food stamps, Medicaid, utility assistance, and even gas vouchers were absolutely vital and made it possible to use my limited income for rent, because the rent always eats first. There were days in the month before the food stamp money was replenished that I went to bed hungry or ate very little. After paying bills, I often had no more than $20 left for the month. No matter how hard I worked, it never felt like it was enough or that I was enough. And this was my unwitnessed existence as I polished another's to make theirs appear perfect. In writing Made, I hoped the book would change the stigmas that surround single mothers, especially those living in poverty. The stigmas that say we somehow deserve hardship because of the terrible decisions we made to get us there. I hoped people would see how hard we work to make ends meet and how fiercely we love our kids. How much we struggle to be enough while the government scolds us, telling us we're becoming dependent on things that they call handouts, but we call means to survive. I hope that even though it's just me speaking to you right now, you'll begin to notice the millions of other domestic workers who invisibly clean up after us for minimum wage. It was a bit over 10 years ago when I worked as a maid for a cleaning company in the Skagit Valley, just north of Seattle, Washington. I wasn't paid that much, about $9 an hour, to leave evidence that I had definitely been in my client's house. I folded toilet paper into little triangles, and I made lines in the carpet with my vacuum, but I was very careful to not leave any footprints. Because as far as leaving evidence that I, a human being, had been walking around in their house, that was almost forbidden. A forgotten rag was enough for a client to call and complain. Only the work, the end product, could be visible. But I walked around in their house like some kind of ghost. As a house cleaner, I mostly enjoyed being alone in these houses. It's probably my introversion speaking too. One of my cleaning clients had this huge house. It was 3 floors, 4 toilets. And I called this house the clown house because the staircase to the top floor was lined with these paintings of clowns for some reason. And as I walked upstairs, I couldn't look at the paintings because I was sure that the eyes in the painting would follow me. The clown house had a really big driveway that dropped down into their garage. So if you can imagine, the top of the driveway where the mailbox was almost at the level of the top floor of the house. When I started cleaning the clown house, I naturally parked in their driveway, and I went in the front door, opened the garage, and hauled in my supplies, the cleaning kit, the bag of rags, the vacuum and mops, and it took a few trips. It took 6 hours to clean that house. Not because it was really dirty, it was just really big. And while I was cleaning, my car, this 1983 Honda Civic wagon, my daughter and I had named Pearl. Pearl she was an older gal, and she would leak a few drops of oil while I was there. The owner of the clown house didn't like this, and they didn't want to see that oil, or I took it as evidence that I, a poor person with a shitty car, had been there. The owners called to complain and requested that I park up by the mailbox instead, forcing me to lug my supplies up and down their driveway. This other house I called the porn house. Yes, for reasons you can imagine. The lady left a note if she wanted me to change the sheets. She wrote, "Please change the sheets." I worked in this woman's home for 2 years, and I don't think she ever learned my name. I saw her in a grocery store once, recognizing her immediately from all the pictures on the walls. And she was leaning over, squinting at some steaks that were on clearance. And I stopped and stared at her for a few seconds before catching myself. This woman had no idea who I was, and certainly no idea what I looked like. But I knew her. I knew that she just made a sudden switch to a peach-scented shampoo. I knew her husband preferred Hustler over Playboy, and that she slept on the twin bed in the office next to a stack of romance novels, the kind they probably sold in that grocery store, the ones with those Fabio-looking types on the cover. Over the 5 years that I worked as a house cleaner, my client list grew to dozens. I not only had the clown house and the porn house, but the sad house and the beach house and even the chef's house. I knew these houses intimately and consequently their owners. And none of my clients knew that I lived off of mostly peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I did keep up with college during that time and eventually graduated with a degree in English. I had this knowing, or really this huge amount of privilege in knowing that being a maid was not my end and being a writer could be. In fact, when I first wrote about my time as a house cleaner, it was for a college writing workshop at the University of Montana. I'd submitted something called the Confessions of the Housekeeper because it was my life at the time, but none of my classmates knew what to say about it. They had nothing to say when my essay was being workshopped. So here I was outing myself as this exhausted, mildly panicked single mother who lived in poverty, and they had all written about their year abroad. So I sat there all wide-eyed, just waiting for someone to comment on anything that I had written. And my professor, David Gates, he picked it up and read a couple paragraphs about the sad house out loud. He had never done that before. And then he leaned back in his chair, if you can imagine a ponytail and sunglasses still on, and he said, "Solid gold, man, that's solid gold." And so I kind of thought, well, maybe I'm onto something here. So a few years later, I submitted that essay to Vox, and they paid me $500. And it was my first real paycheck as a freelance writer, and I thought it was going to be the most money that I would ever see ever at one time. The morning that it was published online, my friend called on my flip phone, and she asked, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "You need to go look at your computer." I don't know if any of you have gone viral, but it's kind of like being caught in a hurricane and a tornado and a tidal wave all at once. Even though I was still invisible as a writer, I had this huge invisible thing called the internet looking directly at me. I pissed off a lot of rich people with that article. Then I realized that as people who hired house cleaners, they were the ones who actually felt exposed, because I forced them to see that the person who was in their home was not only a human being, but a witness, and might go on to be a writer. I also got an email from a big-time literary agent in New York City that morning. He asked if I had a book in the works, and I lied and said yes. So he asked me for a few chapters, and I quickly wrote some down. 11 months later, we had a book deal. And this dream I'd had since I was 10 years old, in a very big way, came true. And I had absolutely no idea what that meant. But I did know this. I'd written about a job where I was paid very little, to not leave any footprints. And now I had a chance to write a book where people could possibly walk around in my shoes. Every day, over 2.5 million nannies, house cleaners, and care workers do the work of caring and cleaning in our homes. Because of the pandemic, that number dropped to nearly half of what it once was, which means these workers were left with no job and often no documentation that they had even held a job to allow them to receive unemployment benefits. Our country is so work-focused toward our low-income citizens that without it, a person has nothing but another's good graces to support them. The majority of these workers are women, mostly women of color, and who immigrated here in the hope for a better life. They take care of what is most important to us, yet they are often the least valued and most vulnerable. Take a few seconds to think about the dozens of invisible workers who have already cleaned up after someone today. The invisible house cleaners disinfecting hotel rooms, the grocery store clerks desperately wiping down their stations, the restaurant workers, the bussers, bartenders, and servers, bustling around to clear the plates of patrons, the janitors in airport bathrooms, and custodians in our schools. These are human beings who work to make our lives easier. That is their job, is to make our lives easier. And we used to call them essential, but we are failing them by not paying them a living wage, not allowing them access to healthcare, mental health care, and often food, not allowing them to support their families while we literally ask them to support ours. As a country, we have lived by a myth that if you work hard and play by the rules and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you're going to make it in this country. For those who believe that myth, they also believe that if you're not making it, you're simply not working hard enough. But the math doesn't add up when we're still fighting for 15. And estimates say a single parent would need to make at least $30 an hour to make ends meet, or work 140 hours a week at a minimum wage job. Even now, for those who turn to the government for support, there's an air of mistrust and judgment. The stigma surrounding those who need a safety net program, even unemployment insurance or a child tax credit, is that those people don't want to work. But in applying for government assistance, I had to not only constantly prove that I was working 20 hours a week, but that I wasn't squirreling away money somewhere or even driving a nice vehicle. My total assets in the state of Washington were not allowed to be more than a few $1,000s to receive benefits. Saving for a first and last rent and deposit was impossible. Even a 50-cent pay increase could mean that I'd no longer qualify for food to feed my child. The aid application process alone seemed designed to discourage people from even trying. Paperwork was often dozens of pages thick and required access to a computer with internet connections and a printer. Little things like mandatory appointments with caseworkers in the middle of the workday could present an impossible hurdle. After we moved out of the homeless shelter, my caseworker and I went over a 4-page list of terse rules that I'd have to agree to in order to live at their transitional housing apartment. For the homeless shelter, I had rules like, guest understands this is an emergency shelter. This is not your home. Random urinalysis may be requested at any time. Visitors are not allowed at the shelter, no exceptions. For the transitional housing apartment, my caseworker made it clear that they'd still do random checks to make sure the daily household chore minimums were met. I again agreed to random urinalysis tests, random unit inspections, and a 10 p.m. curfew. Overnight visitors were not allowed without permission and for no longer than 3 days. All changes in income had to be reported immediately. Monthly statements had to be submitted with details about what money came in and how and why it went out. Being poor, living in poverty, to me seemed a lot like probation. But my crime was having a lack of means to survive. For 6 years, I somewhat stubbornly scraped by as I worked my way through college in pursuit of a dream: to be a published writer, to hold a book I wrote in my hands. But every time my car broke down or I lost a day of work, I felt incredibly guilty for pursuing an education, especially an art degree. I felt like our life didn't afford me this notion of being a writer. And the government did not really seem to approve of it either. The hours I spent in class or doing homework did not count toward the required work hours to receive benefits. So as a full-time student, working 15 hours a week instead of the 20 that I was required to, with a child who was now over 6 years old, I was denied food stamps, punished for fighting to better our lives and my ability to support my daughter. The truth is, once you're in it, there is often no real path out of poverty. The welfare cliff is too high. The obstacles are simply too great. and the system is too broken, though I would say the system works exactly how it was designed to. Caseworkers could tell me where to go and where to apply, and maybe what form to fill out. They'd ask me what I needed, and I'd say a place to live, or I need to eat, or I need childcare so that I can work. And they would sometimes help, or find someone who could, or they couldn't help at all. But that was really all that they could do. Recovering from trauma was also so vital, maybe the most critical, but not only could no one help me with that, I didn't know that I even needed it. The months of poverty, instability, and insecurity created a panic response, which eventually grew into panic attacks that I still suffer from today. Actually, this morning. We expect poor people to live through countless traumatic moments, days, weeks, or even years of unimaginable loss. And we tell them and train them to be resilient. People used to compliment my daughter and me by calling us that, resilient. But no one, absolutely no one, looked me in the eye and said, "No, really, how are you doing? And especially, what you are going through is unimaginably hard, and it's not your fault." No one asked me how they could help. I wished I'd asked for help. I wished I had the courage to speak up for myself. Instead, I hid. I silently blocked friends on Facebook who posted anything that made fun of people on food stamps, or accused them of taking advantage, or spoke poorly of people on welfare. Welfare is dead, I wanted to say. There was no welfare, not in the sense they thought of it as. There was no way for me to walk into a government office and tell them that I needed enough money in order to pay rent. If I was hungry, I could get maybe a couple $100 a month for food. I could visit a food bank. But there was no cash to buffer what I actually needed to survive. And now more than ever, this cash, like the child tax credit or even a universal basic income, is not only needed, but vital. As a single mom who was poor, I wanted so much at that time to see what I was going through represented in an authentic way through any kind of media. I searched for it and instead found these movies and sitcoms full of self-deprecating, often clumsy women with witty, adorable children who found happiness in a handsome man. One of the lines from Hannah Gadsby's show, Nanette, said, "What I would have done to have heard a story like mine." For many low-income people, the thought of writing their own experiences down and publishing them in places where people might actually read them is not only daunting, but unaffordable. But this is the only way that we're going to see change in this country. If we start lifting up the stories from people who have lived experience in the margins of society. I hope those listening to my experiences today begin to recognize the countless other stories just like it that still need to be told. One person wrote to me and said, "Your story is my story, only my daughter's name is Molly." Countless others, children of single parents, wrote to me and said, "I am Mia," the nickname my daughter used to use. Some sent me photos of their cleaning buckets, of selfies with their grown children who had just graduated from college, saying, "I still work as a house cleaner, but I put my kid through college so that they'll have a better life." Even though my book is about the gritty work of struggling to survive, to me, it has always been about a mother wanting what's best for her child. After I turned in the first of final drafts from Made, I took Story, who is now almost 15, out to dinner to celebrate. She was about 10 at the time. And we started by getting some fancy haircuts. And the hairdresser is actually a friend of mine. And at one point she stepped back and said, "Just think of all the work that you've put into this. You've basically been writing this book since your kid was born." Afterward, as Story, who still went by Mia at the time, walked with me to dinner, she was quiet for a few minutes, and that's pretty rare. And then she said, "Is that why my middle name is Story, Mom? Because you are writing a book about me?" And I said, no, actually, your middle name is Story because your dad didn't want that to be your first name. I gotta say, though, Storyland is a pretty awesome name. But the truth is, her middle name came from a quote that I saw in the John Steinbeck Museum right after I found out that I was pregnant with her. As you're leaving, there's this quote painted on the wall, and it says, "If a story is not about the hearer, he will not listen. And here I make a rule. A great and interesting story is about everyone, or it will not last." As human beings, we are all part of a much bigger story, but we have to pay attention. We must listen to each other. After we had dinner that night, I took Story to the fanciest restaurant in Missoula, and I told her to order dessert and get whatever she wanted. She was thrilled when she ordered a butter beer, and the waitress winked at her because she knew that that meant cream soda. We got cake and ice cream, and we couldn't finish it all. I watched her laboriously take those last few bites and thought about how many times I had sat across a table from her and wasn't able to afford something good to feed her, or felt so guilty for rotating between grilled cheese, peanut butter and jelly, and pasta every night. Those years we spent on food stamps were ones of me wishing that I could give her more. Those times that we really struggled, when I went to bed exhausted, cold, and hungry, my number one fear was that someone would find out about us living in this moldy studio apartment. I was scared that they'd find out about the peanut butter sandwiches and the mold in the walls that made us sick and come and take my daughter away from me. I truly believe that the only way that we'll see a collective change in this country is by listening to not only stories like mine, but ones from people who have experienced systemic poverty and systemic racism. People who are currently shunned by their lawmakers for claiming their true identity. If we can somehow start to remove shame from struggle, we'll start to see how many of us are fighting in our own way. And we can create a movement toward empathy and compassion. Our dignity as humans does not reside in our success or how many hours we are able to work in a week. Our dignity is being alive, caring for each other, and recognizing we are equals who all deserve the same opportunities while realizing that many don't have those chances toward success at all. I am truly honored by every invitation to share my story and every opportunity to hear others. But it shouldn't just be me speaking today. We need to listen to people of color. We need to listen to people in our own communities. We need to stop and talk to those who are experiencing houselessness instead of ignoring them, or find out what it is that they need, because they probably know exactly what they need. By listening to others' stories, we will evoke empathy and inspire compassion. My story does have a happy ending, but that doesn't mean that I went from welfare to work. I found a wild kind of success that most only dream about, that I dreamt about, but didn't ever think it would actually happen to me. I am so honored to be here and to help put a different sort of face on poverty and to be a voice for an invisible population of people who too often go unheard and have now seemingly disappeared. I hope that is the part of my story and the part of our story that lasts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your experience, Stephanie. She's right. Poverty is often positioned as a series of poor choices and treated as a question of morality. However, the truth is more complicated and systemic. Our partners at the University of Washington have developed the Self-Sufficiency Standard, providing insight on what constitutes a truly livable wage. The report reveals that financial hardship in Arizona is more widespread and severe than the federal government's official poverty rate statistics would suggest. Many workers in Arizona have earnings that fall far short of what's necessary for basic family needs, even if their income is above federal poverty guidelines. Please welcome WFSA's Director of Research and Advocacy, Gori Gladish.
Thank you, Amalia. I feel so moved right now after Stephanie's interview, and I just so appreciate her sharing her experience with all of us. As Amalia mentioned, my name is Gauri Gladish. I am the Director of Research and Advocacy with the Women's Foundation for the state of Arizona. At WFSA, research drives everything we do. Our nonpartisan research provides statewide data to inform public policy and philanthropic decisions. Every facet of our work is rooted in nonpartisan research and is validated by a committee of women who have lived these experiences. And through the research, we seek to identify the biggest economic barriers and opportunities for women and girls in Arizona so we can create innovative, integrated solutions. Knowledge, data, and awareness are vital in understanding how to address the needs of women and children. At WFSA, we partner with numerous organizations to conduct research that guides our work for gender equity. And at the center of the most recent research work is the University of Washington School of Social Work. So I am honored to introduce Lisa Manzer, Director, and Lisa Cooklick, Research Manager at the Center for Women's Welfare at the University of Washington. Lisa and Annie will be sharing their work on the updated Self-Sufficiency Standard for Arizona. Welcome, Lisa and Annie. Thank you for being with us during our luncheon event, and we are so excited to have you both here.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Manzer, Director of the Center for Women's Welfare. And I want to thank the Women's Foundation for the state of Arizona for having us here today to be part of this luncheon and to introduce you all to the Self-Sufficiency Standard for Arizona. I'm going to provide a background on the Self-Sufficiency Standard and address why it acts as an important replacement of the official poverty measure. I'll then pass it on to Annie to provide an overview of our methodology, along with an exciting new tool that the Foundation is releasing today that gives everyone who has access to a phone, tablet, or computer the ability to easily navigate through their own self-sufficiency standard. The standard takes into account family composition, ages of children, and geographic differences in costs by county. The result is a set of costs you can see on the chart on the right. This includes housing, child care, transportation, food, health care, plus taxes and tax credits. Importantly, this year we also added broadband and cell phone costs to the self-sufficiency standard, recognizing the essential nature of internet access to a family's work and education. So next slide, please. The official poverty measure is the best known measure of income adequacy that we have in the United States. It's often referred to as the federal poverty level or poverty line. It's important to discuss here today as the standard was created as an alternative to specifically address its shortcomings. Overall, the poverty measure is just too low, and its underlying methodology is problematic. A lot has changed in our society since the poverty measure was first developed by Molly Orshansky in the early 1960s. Excuse me. Not only does the poverty measure not vary by the ages of children in a family, treating infants and teenagers the same, but the poverty measure does not vary geographically. This means someone is considered poor at the same threshold throughout all of Arizona, and also, whether you're in rural Mississippi or Manhattan. Well, how did Ms. Orshansky develop the poverty measure? She started with a 1955 Department of Agriculture survey that found families typically spent about a third of their budgets on food. So she calculated the poverty thresholds by pricing out the cost of food for a family and then multiplying the costs by 3.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And thank you to the Women's Foundation for having us here today and allowing us to introduce you to the Self-Sufficiency Standard and the different data components that go into it. So Lisa did a great introduction to the history of the standard and discussed a little bit about the federal poverty guidelines in comparison to the standard. And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the methodology and what goes into calculating the standard. So as mentioned, the standard takes a market basket approach to measuring the cost of each basic need faced by working families. This means that all major budget items are included in the calculation of the standard, not just food. So we have housing, childcare, healthcare, transportation, taxes and tax credits, and miscellaneous costs, along with the cost of broadband included in the calculation. The standard accounts for the geographic differences for costs. By county, it varies by the age groups of children. So we have infants, preschoolers, school-aged children, and teenagers included in the family variations. And it reflects modern family practices by assuming that all adults are working full-time and thus includes all employment-related expenses. Overall, the standard provides a realistic measurement for the income requirements for over 700 different family types across each county in a given state. When possible, the data used in the self-sufficiency standard are collected or calculated using standardized or equivalent methodology nationwide. They are obtained from scholarly sources such as the US Census Bureau. They are set at a minimum but adequate level, and they're updated annually and varied geographically and by age as appropriate. So we get the cost of housing from the fair market rent data provided by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. We assume that adults and children do not share bedrooms, with 2 adults and 2 children maximum per bedroom. We calculate the cost of childcare from the state market rate survey, which is generally defined at the 75th percentile. It should be noted that there's no extracurricular activities or babysitting when not at work, and the standard does not reflect higher costs that might result if a parent is working a swing or evening shift. Typically, we find that for families with children, particularly young children, housing and childcare can make up half of the family's budget. Food costs, we assume that all food is prepared at home. We do not have takeout or restaurant meals included in the cost. We base the cost on the USDA low-cost food plan, which varies locally using the Nielsen scans of grocery receipts. Transportation costs are limited to commuting to work and daycare, plus 1 shopping trip per week. Transportation costs usually don't vary as much as other expenses in the standard. We do assume that a job paying a self-sufficiency wage includes the cost of health insurance. And the premium and out-of-pocket costs are calculated from the medical expenditure panel survey data. Miscellaneous expenses are calculated by taking 10% of all other costs and include all items such as clothing, shoes, paper and cleaning products, etc., and also now include the cost of broadband and cell phone in there. Recognizing that essential need, we use the most recent Federal Communications Commission urban rate survey data that's calculated annually to come up with that monthly broadband cost. So with that being said, I'm now going to switch gears and demo a brand new tool that we created in collaboration with the Women's Foundation, which allows users to navigate through the self-sufficiency standard without having to use our Excel workbooks. So you'll notice the visualization has 4 different tabs. On the top, it says explore how much is enough is the first. The standard varies by family type. The standard varies by county, and comparing the standard to other benchmarks. In addition, before I dive into this visualization, it should be noted that the 2022 data is up to date, except for the childcare costs, which are reliant on the previous year's data. As soon as we have the new childcare market rate survey, which was delayed due to COVID issues, we will be updating the 2022 self-sufficiency standard to include those updated childcare costs. So to start with the demonstration, I'm going to click on the Explore How Much Is Enough tab, which we're there, and then I will select a county. So we'll select a Pima County with a family type of 1 adult, 1 infant, and 1 preschooler. And you'll notice that the visualization below is populating based on that family type. And on the screen, you'll see the various costs that go into making the self-sufficiency standard included on a monthly basis, as well as the bar chart indicating the weight of each cost for that family in the month. And the bottom populates the hourly, monthly, and annual costs needed for that family type in Pima County. Additionally, you can scroll over some of these visualizations to find the tooltip, which provides more information on what goes into these costs. This includes the particular item that we're looking at, as well as the methodology of where we collect that information. If you scroll over and hover over the bar chart, you'll also see a further explanation. It provides the percentage of the family budget that each cost makes up. So for example, for this family, the cost of housing is 16% of the budget, and the cost of childcare is 28% of the budget. You can also scroll over to see the family type repeated and the county type repeated. Scrolling over to the next tab, you can see how the standard varies as a family grows and changes composition. Selecting Yavapai County, we can look at how a single adult with different variation of family composition and a 2 adult family with infants, preschoolers, and additional children. You'll notice that the visualization populates the hourly wage needed for that particular family type. And then again, you can hover over the bar to see the monthly costs indicated, along with the hourly and monthly self-sufficiency standard. The next tab shows how the standard varies by county. So assuming that the single adult infant preschooler family grows slightly to become a single adult school-aged and teenager family, we can see how costs vary across the state of Arizona by county. The costs vary from $37,000, $37,545,000 a year, all the way up to $58,000 a year. Hovering over each county will provide the specific family type and self-sufficiency wage in hourly, monthly, and annual form. And on the left side, we have the median self-sufficiency standard for this family type populated, which in this case is $45,000 a year. The final tab on this visualization shows how the standard for 1 adult, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-age child compares with the annual minimum wage, the federal poverty guidelines, and the median family income. We can select Santa Cruz County here to see that the annual minimum wage, which in the state of Arizona is $19,968, is 40% of what's needed for the annual self-sufficiency wage. Now, you will note that there are 2 cities in the state of Arizona that have a slightly higher minimum wage, and those are noted in the tooltip of if you hover over the hourly, the number of hours needed. And so, for example, if that parent lives within the city of Flagstaff, where the minimum wage is $15.50 per hour, then they will need to work 84 hours per week in order to meet their basic needs. Now that concludes my demonstration of the new visualization that we conducted, and I'm going to jump back into the presentation to provide a little bit more information and then pass it back. So we like to acknowledge that the self-sufficiency standard on its own is really just data, but with our partners, it becomes a tool. So it's used in workforce by for training, for education programs to support participants. It's used by agencies and nonprofits and local governments as an indicator of the basic cost of living. It's used by businesses to set base wages and by policymakers to create programs and pathways that lead to economic self-sufficiency for working families. As an example, we have recently partnered with IKEA, the furniture company, who uses the standard to determine base wages in their US stores. The state of Colorado uses the Self-Sufficiency Standard for setting income eligibility levels for child care assistance. And most recently, lawsuits in Washington, Hawaii, Missouri, and Alabama have relied on the Self-Sufficiency Standard to challenge the imposition of legal financial obligations on plaintiffs. So with that, I will pass it back.
Thanks, Lisa and Annie. I just love this tableau. It beautifully brings together all the data and creates just a great way to understand the income needs needed by families. So kudos, amazing, amazing tableau. I'd now like to mention just a few ways WFSA has used the self-sufficiency standard in our work. In 2020, WFSA distributed almost $7 million through the We Are One Somos Uno Resiliency Fund for workers and families. In partnership with the City of Tucson's efforts to distribute federal CARES funding during the COVID-19 pandemic, WFSA used the self-sufficiency standard to prioritize funding distribution. So priority for the funding was given to those individuals and families who did not receive state or federal COVID-19 funding or funds, And for those whose income did not reach the self-sufficiency standard for Pima County based on their family makeup. WFSA also used the self-sufficiency standard to evaluate the income for Pathways for Single Moms pilot program participants. We used the standard to look at the differences in wages and the influencing factors like family size and location. We found that the standard was very different from what the federal poverty guideline had indicated. The standard was also used to estimate the monthly stipend amount provided to the mothers in the program, and adjustments to the stipend are made based on the updated standards. In our advocacy and policy making, WFSA referenced the self-sufficiency standard from our 2018 data in our legislative work, specifically when drafting HB 2016, which was passed into law last year. The bill prioritized the need for people to move into career fields that allowed for sustainable and self-sufficient wages. So, you know, WFSA walks the walk by putting research into action. So in addition to the medical benefits for employees and families, paid parental leave, retirement plan matching, and other benefits, the foundation is committed to a base salary of $52,000, which aligns with a 1 adult, 1 infant, and 1 preschooler family configuration on the self-sufficiency standard for Pima County. It should be no surprise that paying a livable wage to employees increases retention, productivity, and staff morale. And these are the foundation for a highly committed and focused team. And on the consumer side, wouldn't you feel good about supporting a business that also supports their employees? All right, I'd now like to bring Lisa and Annie back to the screen so I can ask them a few questions about the self-sufficiency standard. Hi, Lisa and Annie. All right, so my first question is, we know people have been talking about inflation lately. It's a topic of interest and uncertainty. So how does the self-sufficiency standard relate to inflation?
I'll take that one. Well, I agree. Right now, at this moment, we are seeing high inflation, especially with gasoline. Let me share this. Across the states what we've been seeing time and again over the past decade is that costs at the basic needs level are rising much higher than the rate of official inflation. The CPI, that's the Consumer Price Index. It's the typical measure of inflation used. It includes all sorts of costs such as airfare, computers, new cars, furniture, things that we aren't defining as a core basic need in the standard. Those items just typically haven't been increasing as much as rent, childcare, healthcare costs. So for example, measures that rely on the CPI, such as the poverty measure, they're falling further and further behind. Now, there is a lag in data, and it'll be a little bit of time before we have a real understanding of how this new increase in inflation will start impacting the cost of self-sufficiency standard. And it's something we will be watching and following.
Okay. All right. So my next question is, what is the difference between a living wage, minimum wage, and the self-sufficiency standard?
Good question. That's a good question. So as Annie talked about, the self-sufficiency standard is a bare bones basic needs measure that sets a wage based on an actual market basket of goods. That wage is going to be different for each household, depending on their county and the number and ages of children in their family. A minimum wage, on the other hand, it sets the base that businesses must pay their employees. In most places, that wage level is rather arbitrary and not tied to an actual market basket of goods, and most likely is not going to be enough for a person to support themselves, much less their family. And in most places, the minimum wage stays the same regardless of how much rent, childcare, or food costs are rising. A living wage, typically more broadly defined. I think most of us think about a living wage as a wage that affords beyond just the basics. A living wage allows a family to think about the future and save for life goals. It allows for an occasional vacation, a night out, maybe soccer or piano lessons.
That was an excellent clarification. Thanks. You really made that easy to understand. And yes, everyone should be able to, enjoy life, right? And be able to go out for a meal and let their kids participate in sports without having to feel that financial burden of it. So thank you. So my last question, can you quickly tell us about the full self-sufficiency standard report? What can we expect to see when it comes out later this year?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one. So the self-sufficiency standard report will be expanding on what you could see when I was doing the Tableau demonstration. So we'll have, not only do we have the data, but we'll have additional analysis on the data. So we look at the statewide, how the costs vary by county for different family types. We look at the different family compositions to understand where the financial burdens are. We look at the costs and how they've changed over time in comparison to inflation. For example, we see that inflation is increasing at a rate of about 60%, whereas the standard costs are increasing at a rate of about 85%. So that there is that gap there. So we discuss that in the report. And then because it's a full report, we also get to introduce a little bit more of a discussion around wage adequacy and talking about how public benefits can support families in making and achieving wage adequacy. So that will be coming later out. It'll also include the updated childcare data that I mentioned with that new childcare market rate survey released. And then, of course, we'll rely on the foundation for the release, and we look forward to seeing how the full state is incorporated in that process.
Great. Yes, we're very excited to not only roll out the Tableau as like this, like I said, beautiful representation of what families need, but also the report later on, so we can use that in our other work. So thank you so much, both of you. And as we wrap up this presentation about the self-sufficiency standard, I just want to mention a few takeaways. Right now, you can find the self-sufficiency standard Tableau that Lisa demoed on our webpage at www.womengiving.org/research. And we definitely invite you to visit our site to explore this tool. And as we discussed with Annie and Lisa, the full report will be out in the fall. So we'll be doing a big announcement when that's available. So please make sure you're registered to receive our WFSA newsletter and our emails, so you're the first to know when that full report is released. So thank you again to the amazing team at the University of Washington. Lisa and Annie, your partnership is just so incredibly valued. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
And I also appreciate our luncheon attendees for being with us to learn about WFSA's research. And I hope you are as excited about the updated Self-Sufficiency Standard and the new Tableau as we are. We hope this tool can be used by our program partners, community agencies, businesses, and our legislators to move women and girls in Arizona towards self-sufficiency. And with that, we head back to the studio to hear more from our CEO, Amalia. Thank you.
What a great presentation, Gori. Thank you again to Lisa and Annie from the University of Washington for supporting our communities here in Arizona. We can all agree that research like this is important to the collective good of our communities throughout the state. And this work could not be done without supporters like you. Let's give a big thank you one more time to our sponsors for this year's event. Today wouldn't be complete without asking for your help to continue funding meaningful work throughout Arizona. Donating is simple. Donate using the button on your screen and follow on-screen prompts. And let's not forget the raffle for the mixology kit and swag giveaway. The winner will be able to join us live on Thursday at 4 p.m. for our mixology masterclass with Whiskey Del Bach. And the winner is Candy Grogan. Congratulations, Candy. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope to see you tomorrow for day 2 of our 3-day virtual luncheon, where we will be focusing on advocacy. Have a wonderful day.